if I try and think about, is there a path to meaningfully regulating this stuff? The upside of this stuff is we cure cancer and all diseases and can reverse aging, and people can theoretically live forever. And if we don't do that, all of us are going to die if we don't solve aging. And then the downside is like what seems like a small percent chance that we're all going to die because of the machine god. And the collective action here pushes in favor of it, we ball. Much like Bitcoin, this technology can be described in some ways as like just math. And so it's going to happen, as our president would say, you'll see.
All right. Back with another week of the Bitcoin Policy Hour. We're going to dig into a particular topic today, which is AI, Chinese AI influence, trying to steer policy here in the United States. And we've got a great report from BPI's head of research, Sam Lyman, that we'll be digging into, and maybe we'll have him on the show next week. But some background. On April 29th of this year, the United States Senate hosted a panel on the existential threat of AI. There were 4 panelists. 2 of them worked for the Chinese government, and 1 sits today as counselor of the State Council of the People's Republic of China. And the senator who convened the panel, of course, our friend Bernie Sanders, had introduced legislation 1 month earlier imposing a federal moratorium on new American AI data centers. I'm Zach Cohen. With me, as usual, Ken Egan, head of government affairs at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, Zach Shapiro, head of policy at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And we've got a lot to break down on this episode. So, Ken, I'm going to kick it to you to give us your initial reaction on this report that Sam put together. We've got some real interesting, sort of breaking research here, something that I think a lot of people suspected, but maybe didn't have full evidence for. So, yeah, what's your initial reaction here? And for policymakers, what do you make of this? What do we do about it?
So it's sort of accepted right now in Washington that NGOs often play sort of a pernicious role in affecting policy. A lot of these NGOs are financed by billionaires. A lot of them actually get taxpayer money. And I think the work that Sam put together does a good job at revealing that. But that's just one part of the story. So here's the question I ask myself. Honest people could have a fair debate about whether data center expansion is good. I don't know that I would necessarily want to live next to a data center. I live in Northern Virginia, and there are a lot of data centers here. So fair people can have that debate. What I don't understand is when introducing his bill, Senator Bernie Sanders, Vermont, and her companion bill, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York City, why they opted to include on their panel 2 members of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't understand why they needed to do that. I don't understand the motivation. I don't understand how their staff didn't conduct basic Google tests. One of the members was on the State Council. Now, the State Council is in a very important body. It is the administrative arm of the CCP. It is how the CCP pushes policy down through the Chinese government. It is the administrative arm of the Communist Party for the government of China, and one of the members sits on that council. He's a senior technology advisor. So the question I think that Sam's paper raises well and highlights and calls out is the fact that we invited, Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez invited 2 members of the CCP to participate in a panel to convince American policymakers that the AI data center expansion is problematic. Now, that's bad enough, but that as you said, that was in April. In May, there is a journal called Qixi, which is the Chinese part, which is the CCP's magazine. It's their journal. It's where they put out theoretical guidance. In that, another member, this is not a state council member. He's the chair. He's a senior representative at the Chinese Academy of Science. I forget the acronym is escaping me. In Chinese Communist Party literature, they advocate for the aggressive expansion of AI, of compute, of aligning energy resources to achieve those goals. The exact direct opposite of what Senator Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez AOC's bill would do, but also directly in contrast with what these 2 members of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, testified to. Well, I shouldn't say testified. They were at a panel, so it was not testimony. Point being, in one audience, you have members of the Chinese government telling the United States we need to roll back our data center development, we need to roll back our construction of compute infrastructure. On the other side, the Chinese Communist Party's actual theoretical journal, essentially their thought magazine, published just weeks later an article by a senior academic advocating for just that, for expanding compute, for bridging the East-West China. Now I see East-West, that east of China, Western China divide, building out energy networks to support that compute power. So and this is again why I'm a bit of a loss. I don't know why Senator Sanders, Representative Ocasio-Cortez decided to invite these people to the panel. They didn't need to do it. If you ask anybody in certainly in Northern Virginia, but I know a lot of the discussion now is based in what's going on in Utah and Kevin O'Leary's project. There are plenty of people who have all kinds of reasonable gripes with what data centers can do. Some of it's informed, some of it's not. Nonetheless, there's plenty of domestic, honest opposition to it that you don't need to bring in representatives of an adversarial government who tell you to do one thing, but then in their official policy channels do another. I do not understand. It makes no sense. I'm a bit of a loss. So I think Sam did a great job of calling it out.
Zach, I'm also curious on your initial reaction here. I think maybe we've been talking about this for some time, but I'm curious to your reaction of it being mapped sort of, thoroughly and succinctly.
Look, I think the evidence in Sam's paper is very convincing that this is meant to be an influence operation. And the question is what to do about that. And I think there's like a lot of different threads to tease apart here. One is, I think there's a big difference between local opposition to data centers. I think, frankly, a lot of which is just misinformed. This is something we've dealt with for a long time as it relates to Bitcoin mining. That's sort of one domestic US political thread that's going on. And then I think the critique from Bernie Sanders and AOC, and between the two of them, it's a little bit different, is a critique of a different type. And it is interesting that, it'd be interesting to see evidence if the Chinese are involved in sort of local protests over sort of like data center NIMBYism. But what we seem to have evidence they're supporting here is really more broader threats about data center build out as sort of like an existential holistic issue, right? So it's a problem for the environment. It's a problem, right, because it uses energy. It's the same sort of stuff we've dealt with for years with Bitcoin mining. It's a problem for the economy in that you're, automating the white collar and maybe soon to be blue collar labor force, and the value is going to accrue to capital and not labor, which is antithetical to what socialists like Bernie Sanders and AOC typically look for. And then Bernie Sanders in particular is really focused on this sort of like Yutkowskian effective altruist, like tail risk of AI killing us all concern. And I think, frankly, the effects of data centers on local economies, I have a little bit less sympathy for that policy issue. I think that's mostly based on misunderstanding. I think there is some real truth to economic concerns about class stratification as the economy gets more and more automated. And I think there are going to be extreme winners and losers, and there might not be the same number of winners as there are losers. I think that's a legitimate policy debate to have. I also think that the tail risk, although it's probably not the most likely scenario, is a real enough concern that is worth taking seriously and treating on the merits. But I don't think it helps either of those discussions to have it sort of mixed in with or poisoned by like actual foreign influence operations that are meant to give a strategic advantage to an adversary, over the United States, especially where, as Ken was saying, they're saying one thing here, they are doing another thing there. And even for people who sort of like believe in we need to slow down and think about policy and not sort of be maximalist in terms of building out data centers, I think it really undermines your case and really muddies the water when it's easy to point to, well, like this is exactly what the Chinese want to do, because the strongest argument, or one of the strongest arguments in favor of the build out, is that we need to beat this China in the AGI race. And then the other dynamic here, which is sort of less about China, but it's interesting to sort of just watch happen politically. the domestic forces, I think, that are going to really come to bear. On the one side, there seems to be, and maybe we'll get to this more talking about like where the economy is right now, infinity demand for inference. Um, Anthropic is throttling its models because it doesn't have enough inference to serve them. And enterprise seems to be the killer use case for now. But like it's super profitable to replace expensive humans with inexpensive tokens, and so there's just there's infinite demand for tokens, and in order to remotely serve that, especially as more and more people just realize AI is useful, we're going to need all of the electricity and all of the data centers we can possibly build. And even that's not going to be enough, right? We're going to need to figure out data centers in space or crazy stuff like that. On the other hand, I fully expect that there's going to be a huge political backlash, specifically, at least in the near term, on the economics of what's happening, right? Like a year ago, everyone was debating, oh, there's all this money being spent on data centers. It's too much. The chips are going to be efficient. The Jevons paradox stuff is stupid. And this is going to be like the dot-com crash because we don't see the revenue for OpenAI and Anthropic, and like this is a hype story that they're telling to their VCs to raise money. Well, that was totally wrong, right? Like they saw where the puck was headed. And I think the same thing is happening now around like job displacement, where people are saying, oh, well, like this is a story that these companies are telling in advance of their IPOs, like, oh, we're going to have this big impact on the economy, and we need to worry about job displacement and what the sort of like social bargain is. And that's all fake because we're not actually seeing job displacement in the numbers other than like new hires. And I think a year from now, that is likely to look just as stupid as the concerns about revenue. And so I think you are going to have these two forces, like this insatiable appetite for tokens sort of on the capital and consumer side, which is what drives the US economy. And then you're maybe more and more organized sort of politics around the labor side of this, where people are worried about losing their jobs as that actually starts to show up in the data. And that's going to be a mess as it is. I don't think we need China involved.
Mm-hmm. I want to pull on that local opposition thread, Zach. I will say, like, at school, I hear over and over again this this environmental question, and I hear over and over the job loss. I can't get a job. This AI thing sucks. Like it's melting all our brains, and nobody's gonna be able to read or write anymore. Like it just seems to me like with a certain class of people, and especially the young people that again, we're in my circle. This is like really permeated, and I'm like fairly convinced that it's like all the same thing that's coming together. And I obviously don't have evidence that this is part of the kind of like Chinese influence operation, but the narratives do line up. So I'm curious, like, to what extent you actually think these things are separable, right? You talked about local opposition as maybe a different thing from the sort of like Bernie Sanders AOC like existential holistic issue. Where I'm seeing this is like it seems like a lot of the local opposition is fueled by this misinformation that may be connected to the Chinese influence operation. Do you think that's the right read?
Maybe. I mean, it depends on the flavor of the opposition. I think it might look a little bit different on college campuses than it looks in like, community council meetings in towns, where I think a lot more of the local opposition is specifically NIMBYism. Like, we don't want this in our town. It's an eyesore. It's going to be loud. It's not going to create enough jobs. It's not good for our tax base after it's built, et cetera, versus the like specifically environmental concerns.
Yeah, Ken, I also want your thoughts on this because again, there's this like sort of view of the environmental question, the job loss question. There's all these like factors that people keep referring to that are negative, negative, negative. Like we hate AI, it's going to ruin everything. And then on the flip side of that, like I just don't think we really have people like effectively talking about ways that this could be good, right? Like we think about our old friend Matt Pines here and the stuff that he's working on and these really like, potentially, like society level altering events of scientific discovery or whatever it may be. And like that is just certainly not making its way into, again, like my sample size here is like college campus life. But I think also probably like to a larger degree, across society, like people reading the New York Times, like they're not going to read, I assume about like all the positive things that AI could do. So I'm curious, like to what extent you think this is like purely a China influence problem versus like a larger lack of, hey, here are the benefits alongside the drawbacks.
No, it's not only a China influence problem or all the other actors that that our study highlighted. I think, it's college graduation season. There's lots of videos of every college wants to have a prominent, usually, tech leader speak. And Twitter and YouTube were replete with videos of these speakers talking about AI and tech and how students need to learn about this stuff. And they get booed and they get booed. You're probably seeing these. Maybe that happened at your graduation.
Well, we had
I think
we had Andy Cohen, and he was shitting on Anthropic. So
he probably got he probably got a lot of cheers.
He
But I
did.
think he probably got a lot of cheers. But I think what it does is it threatens. There's a class of people that have done really, really well for 50 years. So the managerial class, that college graduates with liberal arts degrees who have done particularly well. They've managed to get jobs in the government, which probably not going to change. The government will change very slowly. But this sort of whole layer of managerial professionals inside companies, HR, accountants, things like that, that have done very, very well and that have held a lot of political power and economic power over the past 50 years. And AI right now directly threatens that. I mean, you see, they're still hiring software engineers. They're hiring different software engineers, but software engineers are still being hired. But where they're cutting the fat are people that have traditionally not contributed to bottom line to serve those managerial functions. That's what AI threatens. But that's the class of people that have held political power and economic power for a long time. And AI goes right at that. If you're trimming first, you're not trimming your salespeople. You're certainly not trimming your the people who run your building. You're trimming the people that fulfill functions that AI is increasingly well suited to take care of. So I think but that class is, of course, highly motivated, already probably politically charged. It's ideological and it's being directly threatened by AIs. I think some people have legitimate concerns. I probably more or less disagree with those concerns, but that's fine. It doesn't detract from their legitimacy, or at least their concerns. I think a lot of it's filled by misinformation. But I think adoption of AI in companies directly threatens that class of people who have been in control and benefit for decades because of the way the systems evolved, the bureaucracies evolved. And I think those are the people, and that's a lot of these college graduates. And I don't mean to be. I feel for some of these people because they were sort of educated and taught to be prepared for one kind of life. Get a liberal arts degree and go to a company and take some kind of design job or HR job, and you'll do really well and you'll have a good life. And that's being slowly taken away from them. If not, well, maybe not even so slowly. And I think that's a lot of the concern, is that it directly affects a very vocal and powerful constituency.
Zach, let's go back to Bernie Sanders and AOC here. You said one of at least Bernie Sanders' primary concerns is this tail risk, right? I'm curious how you would describe that on his terms, because I think one of the natural instincts here reading Sam's piece is to say oh, Bernie Sanders is a puppet of the CCP, and he very well maybe, I don't know. What's the way of framing this where this is actually sort of ideological and aligned with his policy priorities?
I think there are a couple things there, but before I get to Bernie Sanders, I want to go back to the college students for a second. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I think AI is going to impact sort of white collar labor, and what is being taken away from whom. And I think part of the difficulty here is that what Ken was referring to is the managers, right? Or sometimes referred as the PMC, the professional managerial class. That's kind of what's going away. And there is a certain type of personality type, I think a personality type that tends to be reflexively political or really susceptible to sort of the narrative of the current thing, where they're the ones who are most threatened, right? The sort of credentialists who are going to climb sort of the career ladder and have the path blazed for them, as opposed to the doers. And if you're graduating college now, the scary thing is that the sort of large swath of pre-made sort of decent paying jobs as a management consultant or a software engineer or a lawyer if you go to law school, those will probably go away because they're going to be, there's going to be fewer of those. But the roles that are left are amazing, especially for people who are like doers or high agencies, right? Like the Zach Cohens of the world are going to do great, right? Better than they would have before with AI. But the thing about being a doer is you don't really have time to complain about, FUD that you read on Blue Sky. And so I do think that this becomes a bit of a self-perpetuating thing where it's like the people who are going to be hit are exactly the type of people who sort of, complain about this type of stuff. And it'll be interesting to see sort of the economy reshaped accordingly. And the people who are losing out are people who historically have had a very privileged place in society and a lot of political power, which is why I think this is going to be sort of like the unstoppable force of like hunger for tokens meets the immovable object of populist anti AI sentiment. In terms of like the Bernie Sanders and the Doomer argument, Bernie Sanders is kind of like anti-capitalism, right? That's his whole thing. And so I don't think he is just a Chinese puppet. I think this aligns very well with his caring about labor over capital and caring about sort of, what he says fairness in the economy, and sort of not letting billionaires screw up the world, right? The millionaires and billionaires. And I think he comes by it honestly, right? But like he should not, in so doing, accidentally become a Chinese puppet and literally end up parroting like actual CCP talking points, because he's like blind to that, right? I think we saw a lot of this with like campus protests, right back to college students, where people ended up like using actual Hamas propaganda, right? Not because that they did it on purpose, right? Or that there were like necessarily Hamas people who were like invading these campuses. It's that like it is very easy to have a blind spot when someone's rhetoric aligns with your pre-existing ideology. And I think that is the specific risk with Bernie. If I'm steel manning his concerns, it's not that like he is undereducated necessarily about the risks, right? You're talking about like, what if we told people about like Matt Pine's startup who's, trying to solve physics with AI? The concern is what if that goes too well, right? Like what if, Pines is out there summoning black holes and, in a falling world. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could, right? Like we talked about this in our AI 2027 episode, but like the failure mode here is that AI gets good enough at coding and reasoning that's able to create the next smarter version of AI without humans in the loop. And then that creates a smarter version and you have recursive self-improvement. And you very quickly get from as smart as a human on every domain to just vastly smarter than humans. And then we have this thing that's vastly smarter than us in all domains, including persuasion. It can persuade humans to do, what it needs to do. We've already seen like Opus blackmailing Anthropic engineers. Like that's not so far-fetched. And then its goals are not exactly aligned with ours. And it decides to do something where we are an inconvenience. And so it gets rid of us, right? Not because it hates us. It's just like, it's not aligned. I think that is a reasonable thing to at least keep in mind. It just, you should keep it in mind on its own terms and you should develop policies. And the idea of like a complete data center freeze when everyone like wants more AI usage right now, it just isn't good policy. And I think if you were taking these safety things seriously on its own terms, you would end up with different like policy suggestions than you would if your real agenda was like economic. And if you were falling for sort of CCP talking points. And what Sanders says most of the time is like, oh, all these smarter people than me, they are worried about AI risk. And he's quoting sort of the Frontier Lab CEOs back to themselves, which I think there is some fairness, right? It does seem like going from being a nonprofit AI researcher to a, billionaire many, many times over does tend to change your view of how much regulation there should be of what you do. But again, like I just like the we need to shut down all data centers because my CCP expert told me so is not the way to go about this.
In all fairness, though, if you were to look at Shapiro's Twitter, you would see that he is positioning himself to survive the initial culling. So like Zach's not worried about it. He at least round 1, round 2, no guarantees. But I think the irony of it all, of course, and I checked this out when the paper came out, there are no major data centers in Vermont. There are a few small ones to be like telecommunications infrastructure, but there are no major data centers in Vermont. And I'd be very surprised if there were any data centers in New York City in AOC's district. So clearly there's another agenda here. This is not, my constituents are complaining about it. I don't even think there are data centers in New York. I mean, New York State, with having grown up in New York State, right? Huge, high power costs. I don't know that there's any significant data center construction in New York State. Certainly not in Vermont. So you have to. So yeah, there's certainly an ideological component to this. They're not doing this because their constituents are worried. It's not like the people of Stowe, Vermont, or knocking on Bernie Sanders' door saying, "Don't build this data center in our next to our ski slope." They're not doing that, or don't block my views of the Throgs Neck Bridge with your data center, AOC. We don't want that to happen. So there's clearly an ideological component to it. Again, I'm at a loss as to why. Nonetheless, I'm in a loss as to when, assuming they actually believe it, why they would platform. It's not even parroting CCP talking points. They just brought the CCP to deliver the talking points in person. I just cannot get my head around that.
Yeah, and just to go back to the Matt Pines point, right, you take the let's grant the sort of environmental issue, like data centers use too much power, right? But it's what if this research that they're doing sort of unlocks free and abundant energy, right? That just sort of refutes, or maybe not directly refutes, but challenges the notion that AI is just necessarily bad for the environment. And I just don't hear people talking about that. So I do think that is an important thing for us and others to continue to harp on.
Yeah, and breakthrough medical research. There's all kinds of things that it theoretically could do.
Right.
I think very specifically, if I try and think about, is there a path to meaningfully regulating this stuff? I come to the conclusion that there just is not.
I agree.
Because the game theory, and look, and this is going to be the very crass way of looking at it, but I think this is what's going to control at the end of the day, is the upside of this stuff is we cure cancer and all diseases and can reverse aging, and people can theoretically live forever, and we create infinite abundance. And if we don't do that, all of us are going to die. Individually, we're all going to die if we don't solve aging, right? And so, hey, why not roll the dice on this? And then the downside is what seems like a small % chance that we're all going to die because of the machine god. And the collective action here pushes in favor of fuck it, we ball, right? That that I think is where the incentives point, and probably is what's going to carry the day. And even if you get a country to move in the other direction, right? There's the US-China competition to motivate, right? And then even if US and China were to somehow come together and decide they were going to do this, someone's going to do it offshore or on the moon. The incentives are too strong to push this technology forward. Much like Bitcoin, this technology can be described in some ways as just math. And so it's going to happen, and we're going to see how it, as our president would say, you'll see. And so in the meantime,
thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you yeah, we'll see. But to the extent we're steering this, I think this requires really sort of careful nuance and candor, and not sort of nation state incentives.
Okay, Ken, I'm going to lump together two questions here, so you can take them in whatever order you want. But question one is really on the geopolitical side, or the US versus China competition bit, right? If we're to sort of get the lay of the land here, we have basically the frontier models, 4 or 5 of them, depending on how you're counting it right now, in the United States. They're closed source. Increasingly, you can't use these without KYC. And then on the China side, right, you have this proliferation of open source models. They seem to certainly be behind the curve. The question is by how much. And then you lump this influence operation in. And it just seems like the battle lines are becoming more clear about, there is this race that seems sort of undeniable now. You have these two sort of approaches to the issue, which is, hey, we're going to do this influence operation, and we're going to have these open source models, versus the US. Hey, we're just going to build at the frontier. We're going to be the best. We're going to encourage the best to be here in the United States. And so these are the two approaches, right? Question one is to what extent is the US going to continue to be involved in this? Particularly, as they build up relations with the frontier labs, and two, if you're a United States policymaker and you care about the US China competition issue, what are you doing, right? Like, is it to counter this influence operation in some way? Is it to make sure that, we don't have like CCP people testifying in front of the Senate, which I don't think they even have control over.
That used to be a very low bar.
Yeah, right,
Do not
right.
invite the adversary to come to Capitol Hill and tell you what you should do. That was usually,
Exactly. So that's like, I think, where I want to go down here, and we'll get Zach to weigh in too. But like, that's just where I see this conversation sort of coming to a logical end, is like, you know, this all factors into the larger US China AI competition. Like, what are the moves on the table right now?
So economic and military competition is going to require is going to demand that this continues to develop. You're going to have Chinese companies that increasingly integrate AI into their products, robotics, for example. And your American companies are not going to stand by and let that happen. And the time's also going to come where Secretary of Defense and National Security Council gets an intelligence report saying the Chinese have now mastered small autonomous drones that can fly around the world or swim the seas and function autonomously, and they're cheap to make, and they have a lot of them. What do you do in that regard? Well, we have to also build our autonomous drones. So I think the fundamentals of economic and military competition makes it impossible. You could have, fits and starts where we're accelerating and maybe a new administration decides to slow down a bit. But our core national interests are going to require that we keep up. It's just, there's no other way around it. So I agree with Zach. It's the change out of the bottle, and it's going to continue. I think the thing we need, and I think we're struggling with this now in the United States, is power. I think the number is, over the past 10 years, the Chinese have built 3 times as much power as the United States consumes. They've built that capacity. That's tremendous. And you don't necessarily need, and I've heard, people like David Sachs say the Chinese are 8 months behind us, a year behind us with their models. Fine. But where they're not behind us is on actual ability to produce electricity. And there's 2 pieces of this, right? There's having a great model, and there's also inference. There's compute. And what you need for compute is power. So they don't need to have the latest, greatest, shiniest AI model. What they need, they want that, and they're working at that, but they're going to destroy us on power production in this compute. So I think that's where they're putting their money and their efforts, is building a power infrastructure. They've done. This is what they're working on. So this is directly affects the ability of AI to grow. Right. This is the inference discussion. So I don't think they necessarily need to have the best model in the world. They don't need to beat Mythos or whatever else is next. They need to be able to run at scale a lot of agents, just burn through tokens all day long. That requires a lot of compute power. That requires burning a lot of electrons. So I think that's where I think they're aiming to be, just like they are in chips, right? They're in semiconductors. I think they're aiming to be at par with us, but they don't need to be. They just need to be almost as good and have a lot more capacity.
Yeah. Zach, I'm curious on your thoughts here. I know you said, like, fuck it, we ball. But like, if you're a US regulator or policymaker, like, what are the concrete things that you're doing if you're someone who is of the thought that we should win this race against China?
Well, no, that is if you're focused on winning the race with China, that's it, right?
What, just like leave it be? Like, let me just stay out of the way?
Well, in terms of regulation, and then you want to do industrial policy. Mostly, I 100% agree with Ken that, like, the indications are that, like, power is the bottleneck for us and what's important. If China's 6 to 18 months away from getting Mythos, that's a bigger near-term threat than drone swarms, right? You can't really use drone swarms without declaring war. If you have Mythos and you could just find all of the exploits in all of our cyber systems, you can do that covertly, right? Without declaring war. And we know the Chinese are trying to penetrate every important system all the time. And there's reason to think they might be more successful. And what's worse, like, it seems like a lot of what Mythos is just more compute. I think I mentioned this in one of our, like, BPI internal calls, but I was listening to the New York Times tech podcast last week, and they had an interview with a cybersecurity expert who has access to Mythos, and he was sort of referring to it interchangeably with Opus 4.7, and they're like, wait, like Mythos is clearly way more powerful than Opus 4.7, and what he seemed to suggest was that like Mythos isn't that different than the public model we have access to. It just has this ultra mode where it thinks really hard for a really long time, and it's able to find exploits and string together vulnerabilities into 0 days, and like that, it's like custom built for cybersecurity, but plus a lot of compute. And if that's where we're heading, and at least like my own personal experience using AI, where Opus 4.7, unless you're like really careful with it, in some ways is a downgrade from 4.6 because it just decides to be lazy because Anthropic is compute constrained. If we're moving to a world where the model weights matter less and just the amount of compute and intelligence you're willing to throw at something, but brute force matters more, then the constraint is going to be energy. And we're in a pretty bad position in terms of our build out, right? And like you can't get a gas, like we have a lot of natural gas, but you can't get gas turbines until the 2030s if you were to order one today. And so like our supply chain is a real problem, and we need to find ways to fix that. And so if the thing that you're solving for is not the safetyism and it's we're competing with China, is finding ways to unlock energy usage for more and more and more data centers, because this is going to be a compute race. And it seems like one potential vector here is going to be in space, right? That is something that Elon is very focused on. There's a free thermonuclear reactor in space that has, for our purposes, infinite energy, and it's in the sun, and it's hard to vent that energy appropriately, and there's sort of a really difficult engineering challenge. But the end state of this, which by the way is the same end state where we get wiped out, is the Dyson swarm, where ultimately you have more and more sort of like satellites with computronia just circling the sun, and you create sort of like this big shell around the sun where you get all of its energy. And sort of in the like sci-fi futurist world, there's this concept called the Kardashev scale to measure sort of how far along a society is. It's something that's very popular in Bitcoin circles because it relates to the idea of sort of using energy for mining. But you have these 3 levels of society, where a level 1 Kardashev society uses all of the energy available on a planet, level 2 a star, and level 3 a galaxy. What a level 2 society is they just have a big Dyson swarm that they put around the sun. And so that might be the way the like real pardon my pun, moonshot, because you actually need this sort of mass launcher on the moon to make this work, way to bypass the energy problems. But you get into like pretty crazy sci-fi territory. We're gonna need Pines to figure some stuff out before we can effectively pull that off.
Okay, Ken, last question here, and then we'll talk about the AI kind of larger market right now. Is let's say, and I think we all agree on this, that power is the biggest issue that we're facing. And if you take that, is this like Chinese influence operation on purely like what seems to be the data center side the biggest bottleneck, or is it a sort of like regulatory situation where these projects to bring on more power are just getting delayed, or they can't get connected to the grid? Like do you think if you take that approach of like, hey, the power is the number one thing, like should we actually care about this Chinese influence operation?
I think you have to expect that nation states are going to do this kind of stuff. So whatever. It's just like it's like hate the player, not hate the game, not the player. Yeah, that's sort of how I think of it in this. Like, yeah, of course they're doing that, and that's fine. But that's the nature of things. Again, I just don't think we need to enlist members of Congress to help them do it. So on that point, and I think on the general opposition, most of the concerns are if you have an honest, family that shows up to a protest, that their electricity bills are going to go up and their water bills are going to go up. Those are the 2 concerns that people usually cite, right? And then there's noise, but generally speaking, those are your 2 things. Yeah. If you solve the power problem, I think if people can see that their electricity bills are not going up, it may in fact are going down because you've actually built out power infrastructure, or some of these hyperscalers are building power that they're actually selling back to the grid, which I think is the plan for some of these. I think you could see a lot of that legitimate opposition melt away. But a lot of it's permitting. Like Zach said, we have supply chain issues, but also, try to get a small modular nuclear reactor built anywhere in the United States in less than like we'll be literally be Dyson swarming the sun, and Pines will be summoning black holes before they fix that problem. This is the issue. You could China gets these things start up in, I want to say the numbers are 2 to 3 years from conception. We're going to build a nuclear reactor to the thing they switch it on and the steam starts pumping. So I think this is a problem. We need to fix the regulatory issues. But again, there are a lot of, and they're all related. There are the same people that are opposing data centers are the same people that will protest building small modular nuclear reactors. They're the same people that will protest building pipelines. There's a reason why in Bernie Sanders in Vermont, people still get like fuel oil deliveries. My aunt, I have family living in Vermont. They get fuel oil deliveries in a truck that gets pumped into their house. So this is what we're dealing with, right? And that obviously is not a scalable model. So I think they're all related. I think the same organized actors that oppose data center construction are the same organized actors that oppose construction of any kind of power generation. You could easily make arrangement. I think a lot of these hyperscalers would want to do it where they generate their own power. SMUs or SMRs are an obvious solution, but there's more. There are other options as well. So it's all this sort of the same on the organized side. I'm not talking about your average citizen who just doesn't want it. On the organized side, it's the same. It's the same arguments against data centers. The same arguments against construction of power, building out the grid. It's all the same, and you can debate what the ideological motivations are behind that. But it is the same exact people protesting these things.
Yeah, and who's possibly going to help us build out all the energy infrastructure? Bitcoin miners.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, or Amazon. Is it Amazon's buying 3 Mile Island? I think it's Amazon, right? Or is it Microsoft? Somebody bought 3 Mile Island. The famous the nuclear power plant that set off the whole anti-nuclear movement in the United States. 3 Mile Island. It's being restarted. But I think hyperscalers could be part of that. At least in the interim. I think they'll eventually, like everything else. Here's my point I discuss with people. There's the sort of the civilization quotient that is directly correlated to how much energy produced and consumed. Not just produce, but consume. Civilization requires energy and requires you consume it. AI is part of that. If our civilization is going to continue to develop, we're going to have to consume more energy, and that requires building more energy, better sources of it. And I think renewables play a part of that. Nuclear plays a part of that. But we need more. And the same actors that are out there organizing protests, giving the same signs in every state in the union, where you see data center protests, they're the same people that will be out the following day protesting against the proposed construction of, for example, of a nuclear reactor.
Yeah,
a nuclear power plant. Yeah.
Okay, Zach. You said there's an infinite demand for inference right now, and we're definitely seeing that in the market's expectations around a lot of these potential public offerings for AI companies. I'm curious whether you think that's going to continue, whether you think these valuations are justified, or maybe if we're in a massive bubble as the AI doomers would like to think.
Well, those are separate questions. I think the answer to both is yes. I think there is going to continue to be more or less infinite demand for the foreseeable future. Driven specifically by enterprise and not consumer. This is something that I think really doesn't quite show up in the data yet. It's hard to show sort of efficiencies in the enterprise from AI usage. I think a lot of that is just like bad incentives, conservatism, bureaucracy, whatever. But I can tell you as someone who just does this myself for my own business, if you're able to replace human labor with tokens, which is very possible even with today's level of technology and will become more and more possible, you'd be willing to pay a lot for tokens. Don't tell Anthropic, but I'd be happy to pay 10x what I currently pay, right? Like you replace expensive human labor. Now that, again, as we talked about at the top, that's going to have impact on the labor market, which might have impacts on the economy. If you start to project that forward, you get to sort of the like Citrini research, sort of scary cases where people lose jobs and then they can't pay their mortgages and then debt goes bad, and SaaS companies that also have a lot of private debt tied to them become obsoleted, and companies sort of forward-looking multiples and price to earnings ratios start to make less sense because there's so much disruption in the market that you can't. So I'm very bullish on demand for tokens. I think that only goes up as more and more people just understand that they are useful and specifically enterprises understand that you can replace expensive human labor with less expensive compute. But are we in a bubble in general? Yeah, maybe. I mean, the sort of driving factors there would be, if we're talking about the AI companies specifically, um, it's there's going to be a lot of liquidity that is needed when these companies IPO. All it seems like at perhaps multi-trillion-dollar valuations, and then all of the insiders, right? The employees, the private market investors want to see a return. How much liquidity is there just in the public markets to soak this up? Like, we'll see. The narrative is really great when you're in the private market and you're marked to whatever the latest round is. When you're marked to your floating NYSE stock price, that's sort of a different story. So, like, especially 6 months after the IPOs, when the insiders unlock, that's going to be a big deal. And I think it's entirely possible that the IPOs will mark the top of the market. And then out, maybe I think the like Nvidias of the world, right? I'm not an expert in what's their moat or could there be competitors, but the infrastructure plays, I would be pretty bullish on if I was playing sort of fantasy hedge fund here. We're just going to need a ton of copper. We're going to need a ton of energy. We're going to need a ton of chips. Like, the picks and shovels, I don't see going anywhere. But then everything else, there are going to be some companies that deliver goods and services using AI, I hope including to some extent my own, that are going to do really well, but then there are going to be a lot that are massively disrupted. And I think really specifically the biggest challenge, and I'm stealing this idea somewhat from Chamath, who I think put it really well, like when you are underwriting predictable cash flows in a world where, like technology might, and services, it might be incredibly deflationary. It's just hard to justify paying 30 times earnings. And so that destroys wealth effect. The people losing jobs undermine sort of the sort of consumer strength, which is like 70% or something crazy of our economy is the American consumer, especially the high paying white collar consumers that are likely to be the most affected by this, right? Because their labor is the most profitable to replace with compute. And so I think both can be true. And I think my bet is that both are somewhat true. We are in a bubble, and this technology is absolutely real and powerful.
Ken, we haven't seen any S1s yet, but do you think we'll see any this year?
Yeah, and just one final point, like the CME is now offering compute futures, and if you think that that it's not here to stay, like they're selling futures on this, they're selling futures on this stuff now.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the next big one is probably going to be SpaceX. That's the rumor is going to be in June, right? I think mid June. So I think you'll see Elon. I mean, my own impression is that you'll see that
There's been
IPO.
public reports that they've engaged law firms and investment banks to do
Yeah.
this. Like, it seems like it's in progress.
Yeah, and then you'll see that I think within a year a pretty rapid consolidation with Tesla. That's just my gut feeling. I think soon, and you could. I mean, also, I think Elon has a plan for his sort of for his all the companies that he runs, what he wants to do with them. So I think he is a lot less market sensitive to what the IPO might look like. I think the AI companies are probably a little more market sensitive, and like the problem that Zach outlined. You don't want to IPO when you're right now we're in a great credit cycle expansion. You don't want to IPO when you're in a credit cycle contraction. So I think you'll see S1s from the AI companies probably later this year. But I think the market is right now anticipating sort of the great Elon IPOs, and then probably a relatively rapid consolidation of everything under one umbrella. That's sort of my guess.
All right. Good AI conversation. I think we would be remiss not to celebrate the Clarity Act passing through the Senate Banking Committee with a vote of 15-9. And the Democrats that joined that were Senators Angela Also Brooks from Maryland and Ruben Gallego from Arizona. We've certainly been talking about this for a while.
Oof.
It seems like what passed through the committee was bullish and positive. We'll see if that holds up. But yeah, Ken, curious your initial reaction here and your outlook.
I think that the bill that passed through the committee is not a bill that is going to. It's not going to be the bill that is eventually voted on. It's just not. I have that in pretty good authority, and I believe that. And I think our listeners that follow this stuff should not expect the bill that passed through banking to be the bill that, to resemble the bill that eventually is voted on the floor. There's a lot that has to happen. There still needs to be work done on the Senate Ag Committee, and then they have to find Senate floor time. And they're going to want floor time when they have a sense of where the bill's going to go. So I don't know. I think we're still in for a fight. I think we are in for a fight on BRCA. I mean, we talk about that a lot. The law enforcement associations, and not whether they're well informed or not, or why you can debate why they entered this fight. Law enforcement associations are pressing pretty heavily on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans. Of course, that's a constituency the Republicans tend to want to be friends with for a lot of reasons. So there, that sort of law enforcement press has been effective. I think it's misguided. A lot of what you read the letters from, like the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, they talk about how BRCA will prevent law enforcement officers from tracing and seizing digital assets, which is it's just not true. It's nowhere in the bill. It's not true. So it gives you a sense of and there's a lot of prevarication. It could do this. It could do that. I think the law enforcement organizations are being. I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Different constituencies who are pressing some of these groups to get involved in this. I don't know why the National Fraternal Order of Police is really worried about money service businesses. I don't think your average police officer in Fairfax County is dealing with these issues, right? Or in Nashville, Tennessee, or wherever. I just don't think they are. So I think there's a lot of that's just the way politics works in DC. So I think the goal is to have this thing voted on the Senate before July 4th, because we're in election year and there's Congress is in session in July. There's a lot that's got to get done. They're out in August, and then then we're in election season. So I think you'll probably see a vote within the next 4 to 5 weeks. I think that's the objective, but remains to be seen. It's up in the air. I mean, this is again the call to listeners. If you now it's out of banking, so every senator needs to hear from you that the BRCA is important, and don't tinker with the rights of developers. That's critically important for Bitcoin and the community and what we hope to build in the United States. So the fight is, we've been saying this for freaking months, but we're still in there. We're still in the thick of it, right? Actually, we're now in the hard part. It's been sort of it's been a brawl to get that bill out of Senate, out of banking. Still not on the floor yet. There's a lot that's going to happen, but we are not out of the woods. BRCA is definitely under threat, 100% under threat. People need to act accordingly.
Zach, would you say that the issues that were problematic in the banking committee remain problematic as they go to the floor, and those are BRCA, stablecoin yield, and ethics? Do you think that that's accurate?
I think less stablecoin yield. I think it's BRCA and ethics more.
So you think stablecoin yield is sort of settled at this point?
Yeah.
And
I think, by the way, as a correction, I think we read the wrong bill text about stablecoin yield on the last episode of Policy Hour, and it was the thing we were anticipating with the economic substance test, and we read an old version.
Gotcha.
In our defense, there have been a lot of versions.
Yeah. Can you just explain briefly why stablecoin yield would be settled in the banking committee?
Just because it was a headline issue that there's a lot of money behind, and I think there's a pin in it for now, and that really is a industry versus industry fight. Whereas, right, and ultimately industry can come to a settlement on that, right? It's the banks versus the crypto exchanges, really mostly Coinbase. The problem with the BRCA and ethics is that they're genuine political issues. It's not that anyone has a lot of money at stake in one way or the other in the BRCA. It's the developers' freedom at stake versus whatever vague nonsense the Fraternal Order of Police is saying. And then on ethics, right? This isn't there's that much money at stake either, but it's just really good politics for Democrats to be hey, we can't do a crypto bill unless you deal with the sort of self-dealing in the White House. And that is just thornier when you need to get 8 or 9 Democrats over the line to get cloture.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the ethics discussion is tough because, I mean, we're not, DPI is not wading into that swamp. I mean, it is a purely partisan, right?
Yeah.
Issue. So we're staying out of it. People per personal, but yeah, as an institute, we're not. That's just not something we're going to comment on or get involved in. We're focused on what are our key things for Bitcoiners, and that is BRCA.
Okay, well, good. Everyone listening, make sure to call your senator. Doesn't matter if they're on the banking committee now. It's in everyone's hands. So yeah, that's great. And then Ken, we got another draft of the tax bill, which they're calling the Digital Asset Parity Act. And yeah, I'm curious if you had a chance to read through that. Any initial reactions, or should we put a pin in it and come back to it next week?
Yeah, I think really briefly, I need to go through the bill. I need maybe Zach has done a little more research, but we're still on there. The fact is, and we'll go into detail next week, but there's still no de minimis exemptions for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin miners are still not being treated the way that we think miners should be treated. So we don't love the bill. We're working with the sponsoring offices, but they're focused on getting a bill that they can pass. So that's, and the fact that it rhymes with clarity, it's okay, you're killing me. Parity, clarity. I can't. Yeah, but like to talk about something else. But no, it's actually very important, because we what we don't want to do is set a precedent where there's a crypto tax bill, and that does not provide de minimis exemptions for Bitcoin. I think that's an important precedent to set. So that's the next fight.
Yeah. Yeah, they're keeping us on our toes.
And it had to rhyme. It had to freaking rhyme. It couldn't have been
Parity,
something
clarity.
else. Parity, clarity. Yes, just to remind us all.
That's hilarious. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it there. Almost at the hour. Good AI conversation. Don't fall for the Chinese propaganda. Don't yeah.
Check out the report. It's really well done.
Yeah, it's on our website, btcpolicy.org. Let's see, the name of the report is, in case you're looking for it, Foreign Influence in the Campaign Against American AI, written by BPI's head of research, Sam Lyman. Sam's a gem. This is a killer piece, so definitely give it a read.
And if you want to survive the initial culling, follow Zach Shapiro on Twitter. On X, he'll guide you through it.
And if you aren't already, make sure you're subscribed to Bitcoin Magazine and the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And Ken, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to smash something?
They're supposed to smash that like button and subscribe. Smash that like button and subscribe.
All right. We'll see everyone next week.